In the early 1960s, the United States was slowly sinking deeper into the quagmire of Southeast Asia. After the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and the division of Vietnam into North and South, America had gradually taken over the role of supporting the anti-communist government in Saigon. By 1964, under President Lyndon B. Johnson, the U.S. was providing military advisors, weapons, and financial support to South Vietnam's corrupt and unstable regime. But Johnson and his advisors believed this was not enough. They were convinced that only direct American military power could prevent the fall of South Vietnam to the Communist North. To justify greater involvement, the U.S. began conducting covert operations in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. These operations, known as Oplan 34A, involved South Vietnamese commandos raiding North Vietnamese coastal installations supported by American intelligence and naval assets. The goal was to pressure the North and gather intelligence. The Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, was sent into the area to monitor North Vietnamese radar and communications while staying just outside claimed territorial waters. The American public knew almost nothing about these provocative missions. They were told that U.S. forces were simply defending freedom in South Vietnam. The real nature of the shadow war being waged in the Gulf remained classified. Behind the scenes, however, tensions were rising. North Vietnam viewed the raids and the presence of American warships as acts of aggression. In Washington, some officials quietly hoped for an incident, a provocation that could be used to rally public and congressional support for stronger action. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would change the course of American history. A single naval encounter would be transformed into a casus belli, a justification for war. To the average American in the summer of 1964, Vietnam was still a distant and confusing issue. Most had no idea that their government was already conducting secret raids along the North Vietnamese coast, nor that those operations were about to trigger a chain of events based on confusion, exaggeration, and deliberate deception. The machinery of escalation was already turning. On the afternoon of August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin, approximately 30 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. The destroyer was on a routine intelligence mission, collecting electronic signals and monitoring North Vietnamese coastal radar. Its presence was part of the larger Oplan 34 operations, in which South Vietnamese commandos supported by the U.S. had been conducting hit-and-run raids on North Vietnamese islands and radar stations. At approximately 3 p.m. local time, North Vietnamese patrol boats detected the Maddox and moved to intercept. 3 Soviet-built P-4 torpedo boats sped toward the American ship. The Maddox fired warning shots. The North Vietnamese boats responded with torpedoes and machine gun fire. What followed was a brief but intense naval engagement. The Maddox, supported by aircraft from the nearby carrier USS Ticonderoga, returned heavy fire. 1 North Vietnamese boat was damaged and eventually sank. The other 2 retreated. The Maddox sustained only minor damage from a single bullet hole. No American sailors were injured. This was a real documented clash. North Vietnam had attacked a U.S. Navy ship operating in international waters. The incident was legitimate. But what happened next transformed this relatively minor naval encounter into one of the most consequential deceptions in American history. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson saw opportunity. He ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases. More importantly, he instructed his staff to prepare a strong congressional resolution that would give him broad authority to escalate American involvement in Vietnam. The first Gulf of Tonkin incident was real. The second one, the one that truly launched America into full-scale war, was not. On the stormy night of August 4, 1964, the USS Maddox, now joined by the destroyer USS Turner Joy, was back on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin. The weather was bad, heavy rain, rough seas, and low visibility. Both ships were on high alert after the clash 2 days earlier. At approximately 8 p.m., the Maddox's sonar detected what appeared to be approaching enemy vessels. The crews reported radar contacts and torpedo wakes in the water. What followed was 2 hours of pure chaos. The American destroyers opened fire with their 5-inch guns. They maneuvered wildly to avoid supposed torpedoes. Aircraft from the USS Ticonderoga were called in for support. The ships reported multiple torpedo attacks and enemy contacts. Sailors claimed they saw searchlights and muzzle flashes in the darkness. But something was wrong. Even during the battle, doubts began to surface. Captain John Herrick of the Maddox repeatedly sent cables expressing uncertainty. He noted that the reported contacts might be false radar readings caused by weather and sea conditions. Some sonar readings were likely the ship's own propellers reflecting off the rough water. No enemy boats were visually confirmed. No damage was sustained by either American ship. Nevertheless, the initial reports of a second attack reached Washington quickly. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been waiting for a stronger justification, seized the moment. Within hours, he went on national television and announced to the American people that North Vietnam had launched an unprovoked second attack on U.S. naval forces in international waters. He used this incident to launch retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam and to push Congress for sweeping new war powers. The problem was, the second attack had almost certainly never happened. Later analysis of declassified documents, including NSA intercepts and internal Navy reports, showed that the enemy contacts on August 4 were the result of nervous crews, bad weather, and radar errors. North Vietnam had not launched a second attack. The entire event was a phantom, a ghost created by misinterpretation and wishful thinking. But by the time the truth began to emerge, it was already too late. The machinery of war had been set in motion. On the morning of August 5, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the American people in a televised speech. He spoke with grave authority. Last night, I ordered the retaliatory strikes against North Vietnamese military targets. The initial attack on the high seas has been repeated. Johnson presented the events as two clear, unprovoked attacks on American ships in international waters. He framed North Vietnam as the aggressor and the United States as a nation forced to respond in self-defense. Within hours, U.S. aircraft were bombing North Vietnamese naval bases. Behind the scenes, the administration moved with remarkable speed to capitalize on the moment. Johnson's inner circle, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, knew there were serious doubts about the second incident. Captain Herrick's cables expressing uncertainty had already reached the Pentagon. Some intelligence analysts were warning that the radar contacts on August 4th were likely false. Yet these doubts were downplayed or ignored. Johnson personally pressured Congress to pass a strong resolution. On August 6, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was introduced in both the House and Senate. It authorized the President to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The resolution was rushed through Congress with almost no real debate. Most lawmakers had been given little time to review the intelligence. On August 7, it passed with overwhelming majorities, 416-0 in the House and 88-2 in the Senate. Only Senators Wayne Morse and Ernest Gruening voted against it, warning that it was essentially a blank check for war. With this single resolution, Johnson had obtained what previous presidents had sought for years, nearly unlimited authority to wage war in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war by Congress. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, particularly the disputed second attack, had given him exactly what he needed. Within months, the United States would begin a massive military buildup. By 1965, American combat troops were flooding into South Vietnam. The long, bloody escalation had officially begun. To the American public, it all seemed straightforward. Their navy had been attacked twice, and the president was responding firmly to defend the nation. Very few suspected that the second attack, the one used to justify full-scale war, had likely never occurred. The deception was now locked in. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed with almost no real opposition. On August 7, 1964, just 3 days after the reported second attack, Congress voted. The resolution gave President Lyndon B. Johnson sweeping authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression in Southeast Asia. It was, in effect, a blank check for war. The vote was overwhelming. House of Representatives of 16-0. Senate 88-2. Only 2 senators, Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska, had the courage to vote against it. They warned that the resolution was dangerously broad and based on questionable evidence. Their warnings were ignored. With this single piece of legislation, Johnson now had the legal cover he needed to dramatically escalate American involvement in Vietnam without ever asking Congress for a formal declaration of war. It was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. Within months, the consequences became brutally clear. In early 1965, following the Viet Cong attack on Pleiku, Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. By March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops had landed in Da Nang. What had been a limited advisory mission quickly transformed into a full-scale American war. Troop numbers skyrocketed from 23,000 at the end of 1964 to over 180,000 by the end of 1965, eventually reaching more than 500,000. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution became the legal foundation for a war that would last another decade, cost the lives of more than 58,000 American soldiers, millions of Vietnamese, and tear American society apart. And yet, the justification for that war, the second attack on August 4, had almost certainly never happened. Internal government documents, kept secret for decades, would later reveal that senior officials knew almost immediately there were major problems with the August 4 reports. But by then, the political momentum was unstoppable. The administration had its resolution. The war machine was already in motion. The lie had served its purpose. With the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in hand, Lyndon B. Johnson now possessed almost unlimited power to wage war in Vietnam. He did not waste time. In February 1965, after a Viet Cong attack on the U.S. base at Pleiku, Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. In March 1965, the first official U.S. combat troops began landing in Da Nang. What had been a relatively small advisory mission suddenly exploded into a full-scale American war. The escalation was breathtaking in its speed and scale. By the end of 1965, over 180,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. By the end of 1966, more than 385,000. By 1968, peak of over 536,000 American soldiers. The war that followed would consume an entire generation. More than 58,000 Americans would die. Over 300,000 would be wounded. The Vietnamese death toll, both north and south, would reach several million. Entire villages were destroyed. Chemical weapons like Agent Orange poisoned the land and future generations. The war tore American society apart at home, sparking massive protests, cultural division, and a profound loss of trust in government. All of this was enabled in large part by the events of August 4, 1964, an attack that almost certainly never happened. Years later, the truth slowly emerged. In 1968, even Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara privately admitted to Johnson that the second attack was highly doubtful. Declassified NSA documents released in 2005 finally confirmed what many insiders had known for decades. The August 4 incident was based on misread radar signals, anxious sonar operators, and confirmation bias. There were no North Vietnamese torpedo boats on the night of August 4. The administration had not just been mistaken. In many cases, they had knowingly exaggerated and manipulated intelligence to achieve a political goal. They needed a dramatic incident to rally Congress and the public. They got one, even if they had to invent it. The true cost of the lie was paid in blood, treasure, and national trauma that still echoes in American society today. For years, the truth about the Gulf of Tonkin incident remained buried under layers of classification, denial, and political self-preservation. The Johnson administration, and later the Nixon administration, aggressively defended the official narrative. They insisted both attacks had been real and unprovoked. When doubts began to surface inside the Pentagon and intelligence community, those concerns were quietly suppressed or dismissed. Documents that contradicted the story were classified or destroyed. Officers who expressed skepticism were sidelined. Even as the Vietnam War spiraled into a catastrophe, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution remained the legal cornerstone justifying America's massive military presence. Questioning the resolution meant questioning the entire war. For that reason, many in Congress and the press avoided digging too deeply for years. But the truth refused to stay hidden forever. In 1968, during closed-door Senate hearings, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was forced to confront growing evidence that the second attack had not occurred. Under sharp questioning, McNamara admitted there were serious doubts about the August 4 incident. His testimony was kept secret at the time. It wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s that the full picture began to emerge. Whistleblowers, declassified documents, and persistent investigative journalists slowly pieced together the deception. In 1995, McNamara himself acknowledged in his memoir that the second attack did not happen. He admitted the intelligence had been misinterpreted and that the administration had rushed to exploit the situation. The most definitive proof came in 2005, when the National Security Agency released thousands of previously classified documents. These records showed that NSA analysts had expressed strong doubts about the August 4 incident even as it was happening. Some intercepts suggested North Vietnam believed the first attack on August 2nd was part of a larger raid and was simply defending its coastline, not launching an unprovoked second assault. The slow release of evidence over decades painted a damning picture. The Johnson administration had seized on uncertain and, in one case, entirely false intelligence to obtain the war powers it desperately wanted. The cover-up had succeeded long enough. By the time the full truth came out, the war was over, millions were dead, and an entire generation had been scarred. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was finally repealed in 1971, but the damage had already been done. The Gulf of Tonkin incident did not just enable a war. It became one of the most infamous examples of how governments manufacture consent for war. What really happened? On August 2, 1964, a real naval clash occurred between the USS Maddox and North Vietnamese torpedo boats. However, the second reported attack on August 4 almost certainly never happened. It was the result of radar errors, nervous crews, and bad weather. The Johnson administration knowingly exaggerated and, in some cases, fabricated the details to create a justification for war. What was the public told at the time? Americans were told that North Vietnam had launched 2 unprovoked attacks on U.S. Navy ships in international waters. President Johnson presented the incidents as clear aggression that demanded a strong response. The narrative was designed to unite the country behind retaliation. What evidence contradicted the official narrative? Declassified NSA documents, internal Navy cables from Captain Herrick expressing immediate doubt, Robert McNamara's later admissions, and the 2005 NSA release all confirmed that the second attack was imaginary. The administration had pushed the story despite knowing the intelligence was highly unreliable. What mechanisms allowed the truth to stay hidden? Classification of dissenting intelligence reports, pressure on the military to confirm the attack, rapid political exploitation before facts could be verified, and a compliant Congress that asked few questions in the heat of the moment. The machinery of war moved faster than the truth. What should we learn from this case today? The Gulf of Tonkin Incident remains the textbook case of how powerful leaders can manufacture or distort crises to gain the authority to wage war. It proved that even in a democracy, the public can be deliberately misled into supporting a conflict that ultimately cost tens of thousands of American lives and millions of lives abroad. It exposed the dangerous ease with which national security can be used to bypass constitutional checks. It showed that when the executive branch wants war badly enough, it will often create the necessary justification, and that Congress, the press, and the public can be swept along if the emotional momentum is strong enough. More than 60 years later, the lesson is as relevant as ever. Skepticism toward official justifications for war is not cynicism. It is a democratic duty, because once the lie is accepted and the bombs begin to fall, the truth often comes too late to stop the tragedy. The phantom attack in the Gulf of Tonkin still echoes. It reminds us that some of the most expensive wars in history began not with a real enemy attack, but with a story that powerful men needed to be true.